Right now, roughly 8 feet beneath the polished granite of London's financial district, there is a wall. It is not made of brick or stone, it is made of people. Thousands of them, stacked in deliberate orderly rows, sealed in the cold London clay in the year 1348, and left exactly where they fell for nearly 7 centuries. The modern city above them does not advertise this. There is no plaque on Charterhouse Square. The bankers crossing the garden on their way to lunch are walking across the lid of a medieval mass grave, and almost none of them know it. This is not a horror story. Every detail you are about to hear was excavated, recorded, and published. The horror, such as it is, comes from how ordinary the reasons are. Nobody opened this world because nobody could be bothered, because it was cheaper to leave it, because the law made disturbing it slow, expensive, and someone else's problem, and so it stayed sealed. Not behind a vault, but behind paperwork, behind liability, behind the quiet municipal consensus that some doors are simply not worth the cost of opening. Beneath your feet, if you were standing there, lie the buried rivers of London, the bricked-over arteries the city damned and forgot, the dark Victorian tunnels half flooded with still black water. And below those, layer on layer, the centuries the city chose to pave over rather than face. We are going to go down through all of it slowly and methodically, until the modern glass skyline above feels like the thin and temporary thing it actually is. If you find a place like this worth sitting with, hit subscribe and stay down here in the dark a while. It begins, as these things usually do, with a machine, a deadline, and a contract that did not account for the dead. In March of 2013, a multi-billion-pound engineering project was quietly cutting beneath the Farringdon district of central London. The project was called Crossrail. At the time, it was the largest infrastructure works in Europe. Its purpose was entirely mundane: a new railway to move commuters a little faster across a city that has spent 2,000 years trying to move people faster. The engineers were not looking for anything. They were looking for nothing at all. Nothing is what a tunnel wants. Nothing is cheap and fast and keeps a project on schedule. What the massive tunnel boring machine and its crews found instead, in the open dig beside Charterhouse Square, was the opposite of nothing. The archaeologists assigned to the excavation went down through the modern surface and into the clay. This is routine. In London, every major dig comes with archaeologists attached, the way every surgery comes with someone counting the instruments. They are there because the city is, in the most literal sense, built on its own dead, and the law requires someone to be watching when the ground is opened. Usually they find pottery, a coin, an old wall, the dull inventory of a place continuously occupied for 2 millennia. This was not one of those times. About 2.5 meters down in the dark London clay, the soil changed. Not gradually the way soil usually changes, but sharply into something dense and pale and ordered. The diggers had reached a layer of human skeletons. Not scattered, not the chaotic jumble you might expect from a panic, but laid out in careful rows, head to toe, in 2 neat layers, packed with a discipline that is somehow more unsettling than disorder would have been. 25 in that first trench, and the estimate for what lay around it still buried ran to many thousands. They had cut into the edge of a medieval emergency burial ground, and the edge was all they were ever going to be allowed to take. The order is the first clue, and it is worth sitting with. We imagine a plague as chaos, bodies in the street, carts, mass panic, and there was plenty of that. But the people who dug this particular ground were not panicking. They were administrators. They had laid out a grid. They had bought the land legally, in advance, in anticipation of a death toll they correctly predicted would overwhelm every churchyard in the city. The neat rows of skeletons are not the work of the terrified. They are the work of a medieval bureaucracy doing what bureaucracies do, imposing procedure on catastrophe. That same instinct to file the dead tidily and move on is the instinct that would later seal this place for good. The archaeologists did what modern law allows, which is not much. They recorded. They photographed the excavation. They lifted a small, carefully chosen sample of the remains for study, under license, every removal logged. And then, for the overwhelming majority of the burial ground, they did the thing that defines this entire story. They left it. They covered it back over with soil, they built the railway around it and above it and beside it, and they let the thousands stay precisely where they had been put in 1348. This is standard practice, and it has a bloodless technical name: preservation in situ, preserve it in place. Translation: do not dig up what you are not forced to dig up, because it is cheaper, faster, and the legal path of least resistance. And so a mass grave the size of a city block remains sealed beneath central London to this day, not by any conspiracy, but by a clause. From the small sample they were permitted to take, the scientists in the laboratory extracted teeth. This is deliberate. A tooth is a sealed container. The hard enamel shell protects the soft pulp inside from the centuries, from the groundwater, from the bacteria of the soil. Crack that shell in a clean lab, and the material trapped within can be 600 years old and still legible. What they were reading for was not the person, it was what had killed the person, and inside the dental pulp they found it. The genetic signature of Yersinia pestis. The plague itself, not alive. This matters, and we will say it plainly, because the distinction is the entire point. What survives in those teeth is not a living infectious organism, it is a blueprint, an inert sequence of genetic code, a chemical fossil of the bacterium as dangerous to you as a photograph of a fire is hot. The pathogen died with its host in 1348, only its instructions remain, and yet the instructions were enough. By sequencing that inert code, researchers reconstructed the genome of the exact strain that swept through London, compared it to the plague bacteria still circulating in parts of the world today, and placed it on a family tree of disease to watch where its branch sat. The dead, in other words, were still talking, not because anything had been kept alive, but because the city, out of pure procedural habit, had preserved them in clay cold enough and still enough to hold the message intact. London did not save these bodies out of reverence, it saved them out of indifference. And indifference, it turns out, is an excellent preservative. Step back from the laboratory and consider the geography, because the geography is where this stops being history and becomes something you can feel under your shoes. The sequenced strain came from teeth that came from bodies that are, for the most part, still down there. The sample was a few dozen. The grave is thousands, which means the precise material the scientists studied has near identical neighbours by the tens of thousands, lying undisturbed within meters of a working railway platform. Commuters stand above them every morning. The trains run, the escalators turn, and below the last tiled step, past the concrete, in the dark clay, the orderly rows continue, sealed, recorded once and otherwise left entirely alone. To understand why they were down there in such numbers, laid out with such grim efficiency, we have to go back. Not far in the scale of this city, just to the year the order was given. 18 months in which London learned with mathematical clarity that it did not have enough ground to bury its own dead, and built new ground on purpose to contain them. The men who bought that field were neither villains nor heroes. They were officials with a problem of arithmetic. The arithmetic was the Black Death. It arrived the way bad news travelled in the 14th century, which is to say it arrived before the people who could have warned you. The disease moved up through Europe, across 1347 and into 1348, along the trade routes, in the holds of ships, in the rigging, in the rats and the fleas. By the autumn of 1348, it had reached the south coast of England. By that winter, it was in London. The walled city at the time held perhaps 70,000 people, packed into a dense, filthy, vertical warren of timber houses inside the old Roman walls. It was, from the plague's perspective, perfect. Warm bodies, close together, no understanding of contagion, and a deep civic confidence that prayer and procedure could manage anything. Two of those three things were about to be tested to destruction. There is a temptation here to reach for spectacle, to describe the carts and the screaming and the bodies in the gutters. Some of that is accurate. But the detail that actually matters is quieter and far more modern. The city's institutions kept functioning, records were still kept, wills were still witnessed, in enormous and rising numbers, until the men who witnessed them began to die as well. Land was still bought and sold, and it was through this surviving machinery of clerks and deeds and signatures, not through chaos, that London solved the problem of where to put the dead. The churchyards filled within weeks. Consecrated ground inside the walls was a finite resource, and it ran out. So the authorities did the administratively obvious thing. They went shopping for more. The land they acquired sat outside the crowded core, in open ground on the edge of the city. It was available, and crucially it could be consecrated quickly, turned from ordinary field into legitimate burial ground with the right words said over it by the right authority. Speed was the entire point. You could not, under the rules of the time, simply tip Christian dead into an unblessed pit. The ground had to be made holy first. So the holiness was arranged at speed by men working through a backlog of the dying, and the field became a cemetery by decree in advance of the bodies it was brought to hold. They were, in the most literal sense, building capacity, provisioning for a disaster they could see coming up the river toward them. And then they dug. Not graves in the ordinary sense of one person, one hole, a stone and a name. The numbers had moved beyond that long ago. They dug trenches. Long, deep, multi-layered trenches into which the dead were placed in those careful rows we would find 6 centuries later, layered 2 and 3 deep, separated by the thin partings of soil, packed with the same tidy economy you would use to store anything you had too much of and too little room for. The care is real and worth not flinching from. These were not careless people. Even at the height of it, even drowning in mortality, they laid each body out properly, oriented correctly, treated according to the form. They simply had to do it thousands of times, fast, in a field bought for the purpose. The result was an engineered landscape of the dead, and then the plague burned through its fuel as plagues do and receded, and the exhausted city turned its back on the field and got on with the business of surviving. What happened next is the part the title promises, and it is the opposite of dramatic. The field was full, so they stopped using it. The grass grew back. The city over the following centuries did what London always does. It expanded outward and upward, folding the old margins into the new centre, building over the field without ceremony, because the people who knew what the field was had themselves died, generation by generation, until the knowledge thinned to a line in a record and then to nothing at all. The dead were not hidden. They were forgotten in the ordinary way by the slow administrative erosion of memory until a railway company in the 21st century cut a hole in the ground and reminded everyone, briefly, that the foundation of the modern city is the orderly, sealed, and very nearly forgotten apparatus of an old one's worst year. The Crossrail teeth did not give up their secret easily, and the process by which they did is worth slowing down on, because it is the quiet engine underneath the whole story. When the sample reached the laboratory, the first task was not analysis, but decontamination. A tooth that has spent 6 centuries in burial clay is coated in the genetic noise of everything that has touched it since. Soil bacteria, fungi, the hands of the diggers, the modern air of the lab itself. The challenge in ancient DNA work is not finding genetic material. It is finding the right genetic material and proving it is old rather than a modern contaminant that wandered in. So the surface of each tooth was cleaned, the outer layers stripped away, until only the sealed interior remained. The pulp chamber that the enamel had been guarding since the body went into the trench. That sealed interior is the reason teeth are chosen over bone. Bone is porous, it breathes, in a slow geological sense, exchanging material with the ground around it across the centuries. A tooth does not. The enamel is the hardest substance the human body produces, and the pulp it encloses sat in a chamber that, in the right cold and stable conditions, behaves like a time capsule sealed in 1348. The London clay provided exactly those conditions. Cold, wet, oxygen-poor, chemically stable, undisturbed. The same dull properties that made the clay a nuisance to tunnel through made it a near-perfect preservative. The grave was accidentally engineered, by geology and indifference, to keep its contents legible. Inside the pulp, alongside the person's own genetic material, the lab found fragments of something else. Short, broken pieces of DNA that did not belong to a human being. When these fragments were assembled and compared against known sequences, they matched Yersinia pestis. And here the work becomes genuinely delicate because a single match proves very little. DNA degrades over time into ever shorter pieces, and the pattern of that degradation has a signature. Genuinely ancient DNA shows specific kinds of damage at the ends of its fragments, chemical changes that accumulate over centuries and cannot be faked by a modern contaminant. The London fragments showed that damage. The plague signature was old. It had been in the tooth since the tooth's owner died, which is to say since the winter the disease reached the city. From there, the reconstruction proceeded the way you would assemble a shredded document. Each fragment is a strip of the original page. Individually meaningless, collectively, with enough of them and enough overlap they can be laid against one another until the original sequence reappears. The researchers built up the genome of the London strain in this way, fragment over fragment, until they had something they could compare. And the comparison is where the dead stopped being a local curiosity and became a data point in a much larger map. The London strain could be placed against plague samples from elsewhere in Europe, from earlier and later outbreaks, and from the bacterium as it still exists in the world today, because Yersinia pestis never went extinct. It still lives in rodent populations across parts of Asia, Africa, and the Americas. it still rarely kills people. The thing that emptied the medieval city is not a historical artifact. It is a current organism with a long memory, and the London teeth let scientists read one specific page of its history with unusual precision. What they learned is sobering in an understated way. The strain that hit London was not exotic. It sat close to the root of the family tree that produced most of the plague lineages circulating in the centuries that followed. London in 1348 was not an isolated tragedy, but an early, well-preserved chapter of a story that would keep recurring in waves for another 300 years. The same ground would be reopened for the same reason again and again, because the plague came back and back and back. The 1348 burials were the first deep layer. They would not be the last. But the 1348 layer is the one that concerns us, because it is the one the railway found, and it is the one that was sealed and left. Everything the science extracted came from that handful of licensed samples. The rest of the field, the overwhelming bulk of it, was never read at all. It was recorded at the surface where the trench clipped it, documented and reburied. Somewhere under central London there are tens of thousands of teeth, each one a sealed capsule, each one in principle carrying the same legible record, and not one of them will be opened. Not because the record is dangerous. We have established that it is inert, a blueprint and not a bacterium. They will not be opened because there is no legal reason to open them, no commercial reason, and a great many reasons not to. To excavate them would cost a fortune, delay or destroy the infrastructure built above them, and require navigating burial law, public sentiment, and archaeological ethics that all point the same direction. Leave it. The most studied mass grave you have never heard of is also, by deliberate policy, the least disturbed. Consider what that means as a physical fact rather than a historical one. There is a volume of ground beneath the modern financial district, measurable in cubic meters, that is full and known and sealed. Engineers have its rough boundaries. Archaeologists have its approximate depth and density. The trains were rooted with knowledge of it, and the decision made not once but continuously every time the question could conceivably arise is the same decision the medieval clerks made when they filed the dead in tidy rows and walked away. Contain it, record it, and do not reopen it. The seal on this world is not a door. It is a standing administrative preference renewed by default for as long as the city above it exists. We are going to leave the grave now, but we are not going to leave the ground, because the grave is only one occupant of the underworld beneath London, and to understand how a whole world can sit sealed and forgotten under a living city, you have to understand the city's relationship with everything it has buried. London does not build next to its past. It builds on top of it, floor by floor, pressing each previous version down into the dark and laying a new one over the top. The plague dead are one stratum in a layered structure that goes down, in places, more than 10 meters, and the next layers we descend into are not made of people. They are made of water, the rivers the city drowned. London is a city of rivers, though almost no one who lives there knows it, because the rivers are no longer where a river is supposed to be. They are underneath. London sits in a shallow bowl, and into that bowl, for as long as there has been ground here, a network of streams and rivers has drained down toward the Thames. The two that matter most for our descent are the Fleet and the Tyburn. Both were once open water. Both are now sealed inside brick, running in the dark beneath the streets, carrying their flow through tunnels the city built over them precisely so it would never have to look at them again. The story of how that happened is the story of the seal applied to water instead of bone, and it follows the same logic exactly. A thing became inconvenient, so the city contained it, covered it, and forgot it. The Fleet is the larger and the more storied of the two. It begins in the high ground to the north of the old city and runs down toward the Thames, and for most of London's history it was a genuine river, wide enough at its mouth to carry boats. By the medieval period it had also become something else, an open sewer. The city used it the way cities used their rivers everywhere, as a drain, a dump, a convenient moving surface onto which to put everything you wanted gone. Tanneries, butchers, households, all of it went into the Fleet, and the Fleet carried it down to the Thames, and the Fleet stank. It stank for centuries. It was complained about, periodically cleaned, periodically allowed to silt back up into the same fetid channel, and the city's relationship with it curdled over generations, from use into resentment into the eventual decision that the simplest solution to a river you hate is to put a lid on it. The lidding of the fleet happened in stages across the 17th and 18th centuries, and the engineering of it tells you a great deal about how London handles the things it wants to be rid of. They did not fill the river in. You cannot fill in a river. The water has to go somewhere, and if you remove its channel, it will simply find or make another, usually through your foundations. So instead, they vaulted it. They built a brick tunnel around the existing flow, an arch of masonry enclosing the water, and then they built the street on top of the arch. The river kept running. It simply ran in the dark now, inside a brick sleeve, beneath a surface that gave no sign it was there. Farringdon Street and the roads that follow that valley are, in the most literal sense, a bridge over a river that no one can see, several meters wide in places, still flowing, still carrying water down to the Thames, exactly as it has for thousands of years. Stand on that street today and there is nothing to tell you. The traffic, the buildings, the ordinary surface of the city. But beneath the road, inside the vault, the fleet is still there, in the dark, in the wet, in the constant low echo of moving water against brick. It connects now to the city's sewer system, its flow managed and channeled, but its course is the original course, the natural drainage line that existed before there was a city to drain. The river is not gone, it is sealed. It is contained behind exactly the kind of standing administrative arrangement that keeps the plague dead in their clay. A thing the city decided long ago it was better not to deal with directly, walled off, built over, and maintained in the dark by people whose job is to ensure that the rest of us never have to think about it. The Tyburn ran a different course to the west, down through what is now some of the most expensive ground in the world. Its name carries a darker freight because the place where it once flowed gave its name to the city's principal site of public execution for centuries. The gallows stood near the Tyburn, and the river and the killing ground shared a name, and that name became a byword for the end of the road in the most final sense. The river itself met the same fate as the fleet, vaulted over and buried, its open course replaced by a brick conduit, running beneath the streets and the grand houses, threading under the city in the dark. There are places, in certain basements, and certain old cellars along its line, where you can supposedly still hear it, the sound of water moving where the maps show only solid ground. Whether that is true or merely the kind of thing people want to be true about a buried river, the river is genuinely there, sealed in its sleeve, carrying its flow beneath the unknowing surface. There is a tendency when people talk about London's lost rivers to romanticize them, to treat them as a kind of secret poetry running under the pavement. That instinct misses the point. The rivers were not hidden for poetry, they were hidden for sanitation and convenience, and the decision to bury them was made by the same kind of committee, weighing the same kind of cost that decides everything in a city. A river you have to look at is a river you have to maintain, regulate, dredge, and answer for. A river inside a brick tube beneath a road is a river that has been demoted to infrastructure. It no longer needs a frontage or a view or a name on a sign. It needs only to keep flowing where you put it, quietly where the cost of its existence drops to almost nothing. The lost rivers were not lost. They were filed, and the filing system is more extensive than the Fleet and the Tyburn alone. There is the Walbrook, which ran through the very centre of the old Roman city, so central that the Romans built a temple beside it, and which is now so completely buried that its course is marked mainly by the dampness of certain deep foundations. There is the Westbourne, which was dammed in its upper reaches to create an ornamental lake in a royal park, and which in its lower reaches runs in an iron pipe slung directly across the ceiling of an underground station, so that the trains pass beneath the river without their passengers ever knowing the water is overhead. There is the Effray, the Neckinger, the Peck, a whole drowned hydrography of streams that once gave the surface its shape and now exist only as gradients in the road, as the reason a particular street dips where it dips, as the buried logic underneath the visible map. The city is corrugated by the ghosts of its water. You walk up and down the banks of rivers all day without knowing it, because the banks are still there in the slope of the ground even though the water has been sealed beneath it. What unites all of them is the principle we have been tracing since the grave at Charterhouse Square. London's method for dealing with anything it would rather not confront is not destruction. It is containment and concealment. You do not remove the inconvenient thing, because removing it is expensive and dangerous and often impossible. You wall it off, you build over it, and you let the surface forget. The river keeps flowing, the dead keep lying in their rows, the old wall keeps standing. They are simply demoted from the visible city to the buried one, sealed behind the standing preference for leaving well enough alone. And once enough time passes, the seal becomes self-maintaining, because the people who might have reopened the question have all died, and the knowledge of what is down there thins to a few specialists and a few old documents and the occasional surprise when a tunnel goes through. So let us do now what the city never does. Let us go straight down deliberately through the layers and read them in order, because the buried rivers and the plague grave are not floating in the dark at random depths. They sit within a structure, a vertical archaeology that has accumulated year over year, century over century, as London has built on London on London. If you could take a clean vertical core out of the ground in the centre of the city, a single column of earth pulled straight up like a sample from a cake, you would be holding 2,000 years of the city's history stacked in order, oldest at the bottom, and the reading of that column from top to bottom is the closest thing this story has to a map of the sealed world. At the very top is the surface you know, asphalt and paving, a few centimetres of the present moment, laid down in the last several decades and constantly relayed, because the surface is the one layer the city refuses to let age. Beneath that is the bedding, the made ground of the modern era, the concrete, the service ducts, the cables and fibre and gas and water pipes, the dense nervous system of a contemporary city threaded through the first metre or two below the street. This is the layer the engineers know best, because it is the layer they work in daily, and it is also the layer that has destroyed more archaeology than any plague, because every trench dug for a new pipe slices through whatever was beneath it without ceremony. Go down past the modern services and you enter the 19th century, and the 19th century in London means, above all else, the sewers. The Great Brick Sewer System was the single largest civil engineering project the city had ever undertaken when it was built, a response to a crisis of filth so severe that it had made the river beside Parliament unbearable. The engineers of that era did not lay pipes in the modern sense. They built tunnels, vast ones, egg-shaped in cross-section so that the flow stayed fast even when the volume was low, lined entirely in brick laid by hand, millions upon millions of bricks, in arches and barrels and junctions that have outlasted nearly everything built since. Walk one of those tunnels today, and you are walking through a cathedral of waste, an underground architecture built with a care and permanence that the surface city has rarely matched. These sewers are still in use. The Victorian dead built a machine for moving the filth of a future city they would never see, and the future city is still using it, still flowing its waste through brickwork laid down well over a century ago. The brick of those sewers sits at roughly the same depth as the brick of the vaulted rivers, because they were often built together, the river enclosure and the sewer interception forming a single system in the engineering of the period. This is the stratum of containment, the layer where the city did most of its bearing of water and waste, the layer that turned open rivers into sealed conduits. It is a dense, wet, brick-bound horizon a few metres down, and it is where the surface city ends and the buried city begins in earnest. Above it, the present. Below it, the dead and the drowned. Keep descending and the brick gives way to older ground. Here the layers stop being engineered and start being sedimentary, the slow accumulation of a living city's debris over centuries. There are layers of ash and burning, because London has burned, more than once, catastrophically, and each great fire left a horizon of charcoal and scorched material pressed into the ground, a black line you can read like a scar. There are layers of medieval occupation, the rubbish and foundations and lost objects of the city that existed when the plague grave was new, the pottery and bone and leather and coin that the archaeologists usually find, and that the Crossrail dig found alongside the skeletons. The plague burials themselves sit in this zone, a few metres down, cut into the natural clay below the accumulated city, which is exactly why they survived. Deep enough to be beneath the reach of ordinary disturbance sealed in clay that does not breathe. And below even the medieval layers, deepest of all is Rome, because London was a Roman city first, founded as Londinium nearly 2,000 years ago, and the Romans built in stone and brick and tile with an engineering confidence that left a permanent flaw beneath everything that came after. The Roman city is down there, perhaps several metres below the modern street in places, a buried horizon of walls and foundations and roads. The great defensive wall the Romans built around their city still exists in fragments, some of it visible where the modern city has chosen to display it, far more of it buried, running its old circuit through basements and foundations and car parks, a stone boundary 2,000 years old that still, faintly, dictates the shape of the streets above it, because the medieval city grew within its line, and the modern city inherited the medieval plan. To reach the Roman layer, you must pass through everything above it, and to build anything substantial in central London, you must reckon with the fact that somewhere beneath your foundations is a city that was already ancient when the plague dead were buried. This is the structure, then, top to bottom, the constantly renewed present at the surface, the modern services beneath it, the Victorian brick of sewers and buried rivers a few metres down, the accumulated medieval city below that with its fire scars and its rubbish and its plague trenches cut into the clay, and at the bottom Rome, the original floor. Each layer was sealed by the one above it, not maliciously, not secretly, but in the ordinary course of a city that builds by burying, and threaded through all of it, the water, the Fleet and the Tyburn, and the Walbrook and the rest, running in their dark vaults across the strata, indifferent to the eras stacked above and below them, flowing the same way they flowed before any of it existed. It is worth pausing on the strangeness of this as a way to live. The people of London walk around all day on a surface that is, geologically speaking, the thinnest possible skin over a vast and structured underworld. They do it without thinking about it, which is the only sane way to do it, because to think about it constantly would be unbearable. But the underworld is real, and it is mapped, in the cautious and incomplete way that such things are mapped. And the maps are held by the people who need them: the engineers, the archaeologists, the sewer authorities, the railway planners. When a new tunnel is proposed, those maps are consulted, and the route is threaded through the known hazards, around the plague grave, past the buried river, above or below the Roman wall, with the goal always being the same: to build the new layer without having to disturb the old ones, to add to the stack without reading what is already in it, to keep the seal intact, to understand why the ground at Charterhouse Square could be bought, blessed, filled and sealed in the space of a single terrible year. You have to understand the law that governed the dead in medieval England, and that law was not a single statute but a slow accumulation of custom, canon and obligation that had been settling into place for centuries before the plague arrived to test it. The medieval mind did not regard burial as a matter of public health or municipal logistics, though it had elements of both. It regarded burial as a sacrament-adjacent obligation, a religious duty owed to the body of the dead and to the community of the living, and the rules around it were therefore the rules of the church far more than the rules of any secular authority. The body had to go into consecrated ground. This was not a preference. It was a requirement of the system of belief that organised the entire society, and the consequences of failing it were understood to extend beyond death itself. Consecrated ground meant ground that had been formally blessed by a bishop or his deputy, set apart from ordinary land through a ritual that changed its status permanently. Once consecrated, ground was sacred, and it remained sacred, and it could not casually be returned to secular use. The act of consecration was a one-way door. This mattered enormously for a city facing mass death, because it meant that you could not simply designate any convenient field as a burial ground at the moment of need. The field had to be made holy first by the right authority through the right form of words, and only then could the dead lawfully be placed in it. The administrative achievement of 1348 was precisely this: the compression of a process that normally unfolded with ceremony and deliberation into something that could be done at speed, under pressure, ahead of a death toll that was arriving faster than the ground could be blessed. The ordinary unit of burial in medieval England was the parish. Every person belonged to a parish, the local ecclesiastical district centred on a church, and the parish churchyard was where that person expected to be buried, alongside generations of neighbours and ancestors, in ground that had been receiving the dead for as long as the church had stood. The churchyard was not merely a cemetery, it was the physical record of the community, the place where the whole history of the parish lay in the soil, and burial within it carried a meaning that went well beyond the disposal of remains. To be buried in your own churchyard was to remain within the community in death, to lie among your people, to be present at the resurrection that the entire system of belief was oriented toward. The churchyard was, in a sense, the parish's most important possession, and its capacity was therefore a matter of deep significance and, as it would turn out, of severe practical limitation. A parish churchyard was a finite space, and in a dense medieval city it was a small one. Land inside the walls was precious and crowded, and the churchyard had to share the limited ground with the church itself and with the living community pressing in around it. Under ordinary mortality, this finitude was manageable because the dead arrived at the rate that the living died, which was a steady but slow stream that the ground could absorb. Old burials decayed, the ground was reused over generations, and the churchyard maintained a rough equilibrium across the centuries. The system worked because death, in normal times, was a manageable trickle. The entire arrangement of parish burial assumed a baseline mortality and was built to handle it. It was not built to handle a catastrophe because a catastrophe of the necessary scale had not occurred within the memory of the system that designed it. There were rules too about who could be buried where, and these rules carried weight. Burial within the church itself, beneath its floor or in its walls, was reserved for the privileged, the clergy, the wealthy, the patrons whose money had built or maintained the building. Burial in the churchyard was for the ordinary faithful, and burial in unconsecrated ground outside the churchyard was a punishment and a horror, reserved for those the church excluded, the unbaptized dead, the excommunicate, the suicide, the stranger who belonged to no parish. To be denied consecrated burial was a serious matter, a statement about the soul's standing, and the fear of it was real. This is part of why the bought field had to be consecrated before it could be used. To bury the plague dead in unblessed ground would have been to condemn them, in the understanding of the time, to a category reserved for the damned and the outcast, and the authorities, whatever else they were not willing to do that to the ordinary faithful of the city and their thousands. The mechanism by which new burial ground could be created in an emergency therefore ran entirely through ecclesiastical authority. A bishop, or someone acting with the bishop's delegated power, had to perform the consecration. The land had to be lawfully acquired first, transferred from its previous owner through the ordinary instruments of medieval property law, and then presented for blessing. The acquisition itself was a matter of deeds and witnesses, and the careful recording of title, because medieval England, for all that we imagine it as a place of chaos and superstition, was in fact a deeply legalistic society obsessed with the documentation of who held what. Land changed hands through formal grants, recorded and witnessed, and even at the height of a mass mortality event the forms were observed, because the forms were what made the transfer real. A burial ground established without proper title would have been vulnerable to later dispute, and the men arranging it understood that the dead needed not only blessed ground, but legally secure ground whose status could not be challenged once the crisis passed. The transfer of land during a municipal emergency raised questions that the ordinary law had not fully anticipated, and the response to those questions tells you something about how medieval institutions actually behaved under stress. The instinct was not to suspend the rules, the instinct was to apply them faster. The deeds were still drawn, the title was still recorded, the consecration was still performed by the proper authority. What changed was the speed and the scale, the willingness to do in days what might ordinarily take months, and the acceptance that the normal deliberation had to be set aside in favour of getting the ground ready before it was needed. The bureaucracy did not break, it accelerated. And the documentary trace of that acceleration, the deeds and grants and records that survive from the period, is part of how we know what happened. Because the medieval habit of writing everything down did not stop just because the writers were dying. Once the ground was consecrated and the title secure, the actual business of burial proceeded according to its own logic of necessity. In ordinary times, a body was buried individually, in its own grave, shrouded, oriented according to custom, with the proper rites said over it. The orientation mattered. The dead were laid out in a specific direction, in keeping with the belief that they would rise to face a particular point at the resurrection, and this orientation was observed with remarkable consistency across the medieval Christian world. Even in the mass trenches of the plague, as the Charterhouse Square excavation revealed, this orientation was largely maintained. The bodies were laid in rows, but they were laid correctly in the right direction, with the care that the belief demanded. The medieval gravediggers, working through a volume of death that must have been numbing, still observed the form. They were not disposing of waste. They were performing at scale and at speed a religious obligation that they took entirely seriously, even as it threatened to overwhelm them. The trenches themselves were a departure from ordinary practice forced by the numbers, but they were an organised departure. The dead were placed in layers, separated by soil, stacked with a discipline that allowed the maximum number of bodies to be accommodated in the consecrated ground available, while still treating each one according to the form. This was not a pit into which bodies were thrown. It was a structured interment carried out at industrial scale, and the structure is visible in the archaeology centuries later, in the neat rows and the consistent orientation and the careful layering that the diggers of 2013 found when they cut into the edge of it. The medieval burial law, the requirement of consecrated ground and proper rites and correct orientation, did not collapse under the plague. It bent. It adapted into a form that could handle the volume. And the form it adapted into is exactly the form that was sealed and preserved beneath the modern city, an engineered solution to a religious requirement under catastrophic load. When the ground was full, the law governed its closure as well. Consecrated ground did not become unconsecrated simply because it had stopped receiving the dead. It remained sacred. It remained, in the understanding of the time, the resting place of the faithful awaiting resurrection, and it could not be casually built over or returned to secular use. This is a crucial point for understanding the seal, because it means that the medieval burial ground carried a legal and religious protection that did not expire when the last body went in. The ground was set apart permanently, and while the centuries that followed eroded the memory of what the ground contained, and while the expanding city did eventually build over it, the underlying status of consecrated ground as a category protected by both ecclesiastical and later secular law created a presumption against disturbance that has echoed down to the present. The modern reluctance to excavate the plague dead is the distant descendant of the medieval rule that consecrated ground is not to be disturbed. The seal that the law of the 14th century placed on that field has, in a strange and attenuated way, never fully lifted. The transition from medieval to modern burial law took centuries, and it is a long, dry, incremental story of statutes slowly supplementing and eventually overtaking canon, of the secular state gradually assuming the authority that the church had once held alone. But the core principle proved durable. Human remains, once lawfully buried in consecrated ground, occupy a protected status. To disturb them requires lawful authority, a license, a reason that the law recognizes, and the observation of procedures designed to treat the dead with the dignity that both the old religious framework and the newer secular one demand. You cannot simply dig up a burial ground because it is in your way. You must have authority, and obtaining that authority is slow and expensive and freighted with the accumulated weight of centuries of belief about the proper treatment of the dead. The medieval law, in this sense, did not end. It evolved into the modern regime that keeps the Charterhouse Square dead sealed in their clay, and the continuity between the two is the deepest reason the world beneath London stays closed. It is worth dwelling in the flat and patient way this part of the story asks for, on the precise legal texture of how consecrated ground was acquired, because the texture is where the strangeness lives. The land bought for plague burial did not simply pass from one owner to another in the way a modern conveyance works. Medieval property was held in a web of obligation that ran upward through layers of tenure toward the crown, and any transfer had to account for the interest stacked above the immediate holder. A piece of ground was rarely owned outright in the modern sense. It was held of someone, who held it of someone else, who ultimately held it of the king, and the rights and dues attached to it at each level had to be respected or formally released for the transfer to be secure. To buy a field, then, was to negotiate not with a single seller, but with a structure of overlapping claims, and to record the result in a deed that would satisfy not only the parties but the courts and customs that might later be called upon to defend it. In the crisis of mass mortality, this structure became both an obstacle and a strange kind of asset. An obstacle because the negotiation of overlapping interest took time the city did not have. An asset because once completed, the transfer was extraordinarily secure, woven into the fabric of tenure in a way that made the burial ground's legal status nearly unassailable. The men who arranged these acquisitions were not improvising. They were working within a system they understood intimately, compressing its operations under pressure, but never abandoning its forms, because the forms were the only thing that would make the ground genuinely and permanently a burial place rather than a temporary expedient that could be challenged once the dying stopped. They were buying not just land but certainty, and they were buying it for the dead. The consecration that followed the acquisition was itself a documented act. The bishop's involvement, or that of his delegate, generated a record because the church was, if anything, even more obsessive about documentation than the secular authorities. The blessing of new burial ground was an event of ecclesiastical significance, noted in the registers, attested by witnesses, folded into the administrative memory of the diocese. And so the creation of an emergency cemetery left a double trace: the secular record of the land transfer and the ecclesiastical record of the consecration. Two parallel streams of documentation that between them fixed the ground's status in both the law of the realm and the law of the church. This is the bureaucratic redundancy of a society that trusted nothing to memory and everything to writing, and it is the reason that 6 centuries later, the existence and rough location of these burial grounds could be reconstructed from documents long before any machine cut into the soil to confirm them. The closing of a full burial ground was a quieter administrative event, less ritualized than the opening, but it too left traces and it too carried consequences. A ground that had reached capacity was simply no longer used, but its consecrated status persisted, and with it the obligations of maintenance and protection that consecrated ground carried. In practice, a disused burial ground in a crowded city existed in an awkward limbo, too sacred to build on casually, too valuable as space to leave forever idle, and increasingly disconnected from the living memory of what it held as the generations turned over. The medieval city dealt with this limbo the way cities deal with most awkward things, by ignoring it for as long as possible, and then, eventually, when the pressure of need grew sufficient and the memory had faded sufficiently, by encroaching on it gradually, building at the edges, then over the edges, then across the whole, until the burial ground had been absorbed into the surrounding fabric and survived only as a slightly anomalous patch in the property records and a darker, denser horizon in the soil. This gradual absorption is the precise mechanism by which a sealed world becomes a forgotten one. There was no single moment of forgetting, no decision to conceal, no record deliberately destroyed. There was only the slow operation of time on memory, the death of everyone who had stood at the consecration, then the death of everyone who had heard about it from those who stood there, then the thinning of the knowledge into documents that fewer and fewer people had reason to consult, until the field that everyone in 1348 knew to be a vast grave became by 1648 a piece of ground with an odd history that scholars might know and ordinary residents would not, and by 1848 simply a part of the city, built upon, walked upon, indistinguishable from any other ground except in the records that almost no one read. The seal held not because it was guarded, but because the thing it sealed had slipped out of the living awareness of the city above it. Forgetting is the most effective seal of all, and it requires no maintenance whatsoever. We turn now from the law of the dead to the engineering of the ground that holds them, because the two are not separate. The reason the plague dead were so well preserved, the reason their teeth could yield a 6th-century-old genetic record, the reason the modern city can build above them without disturbing them, all of it comes down to the physical material they were buried in, and that material is the London clay. To understand the sealed world, you have to understand the substance that seals it, and the substance is a thick blue-grey, almost rubbery clay that underlies most of the city to great depth, and that has shaped everything ever built here. London clay is a marine deposit, laid down over an immense span of time when the area that is now the city lay beneath a warm, shallow sea. It is fine-grained, dense, and remarkably consistent, a deep bed of material that behaves, from an engineering perspective, in ways that are both a blessing and a curse. It is nearly impermeable, which means water does not pass through it easily, which is why the buried rivers had to be vaulted, rather than simply allowed to soak away, and which is also why the plague dead remained in a stable, oxygen-poor, waterlogged environment that slowed decay to a crawl. The same impermeability that frustrates drainage preserves organic material, because the bacteria and processes that break down a body need oxygen and circulation that the dense clay denies them. The clay is a preservative for the same reason it is a nuisance. It holds things still. For the engineer, London clay presents a particular set of problems that have been studied and accommodated over more than a century of tunnelling beneath the city. It is what is called a cohesive soil, meaning its particles cling together rather than running loose like sand, and this cohesion makes it relatively stable to excavate, capable of standing in a vertical face for a time without collapsing, which is enormously useful when you are cutting a tunnel through it. A tunnel bored through London clay does not immediately fall in on itself the way a tunnel through loose sand or gravel would. The clay holds its shape long enough for the lining to be installed, and this property is the single most important reason that London developed the world's first and most extensive deep underground railway system. The city could be tunnelled because the ground beneath it was just stable enough, just cohesive enough to permit it. The underground exists because of the clay, but the clay is not simply stable and obliging. It is also what engineers call an over-consolidated material, meaning it has been compressed under great pressure over geological time and carries a kind of stored memory of that pressure. When you excavate it, when you remove the material above and beside it and relieve the pressure that has held it compressed for millions of years, the clay responds. It swells, It moves, it tries slowly to expand into the space you have opened, and over time this swelling exerts pressure on whatever you have built in the excavation. A tunnel lining in London clay is not holding back a static load. It is holding back a slow, persistent geological push. The clay's long attempt to reclaim the space and the engineering of any structure in this ground must account for that push across the entire lifespan of the structure. The clay is patient. It does not forget the pressure it once carried, and it works, on a timescale indifferent to human concerns, to restore it. This is why the brick sewers and the vaulted rivers of the 19th century were built with such enormous strength, with their egg-shaped sections and their thick walls of multiple courses of brick. The Victorian engineers were not overbuilding out of vanity. They were building against the clay, against its swelling and its slow pressure and its tendency to move, and they understood that a structure in this ground had to be strong enough to resist not a single load, but a continuous one applied over generations. The structures they built have lasted because they were built to lose a slow war against the ground rather than a fast one, to absorb the clay's patient push and remain standing under it for a century and more. The permanence of Victorian underground engineering is a direct response to the character of the material it was built into, and that material is the same material that holds the plague dead in their preserving stillness a few meters away. The clay seals the rivers and seals the dead with the same dense, patient, impermeable grip. The behaviour of London clay under load is not only a matter of swelling, it is also a matter of how the clay carries weight, and the carrying of weight is the central preoccupation of anyone building underground. When you drive a tunnel through the ground, you remove material that was previously holding up everything above it, and that weight does not disappear. It has to be redirected, channeled around the void you have created, carried by the structure you install in place of the removed earth. The fundamental act of underground engineering is the substitution of a built structure for the load-bearing function of the ground itself, and the success or failure of that substitution is measured over the entire life of the structure, in the slow accumulation of stress and movement and settlement that either the structure absorbs or eventually does not. In the case of an arch, which is the form the Victorians relied on almost universally, the weight above is carried by being directed down and outward, along the curve of the arch, into the ground at its base, the haunches and abutments where the arch meets the earth. The genius of the arch, known since antiquity and perfected by the Romans whose buried city lies beneath all of this, is that it converts the downward press of a great load into a pattern of compression that masonry is exceptionally good at resisting. Brick and stone are strong in compression and weak in tension, strong when squeezed and weak when pulled, and the arch arranges things so that the entire structure is squeezed and nothing is pulled. A properly built brick arch under load is in a state of pure compression throughout, every brick pressing against its neighbours, the whole assembly locked together by the very weight it is carrying. This is why the Victorian sewers and the river vaults have lasted. They were built in the one configuration that turns the burden into the source of their own stability. The load that would destroy a flat structure is the load that holds the arch together. The egg-shaped section of the great sewers refines this principle further, and the refinement is worth understanding for what it reveals about the care of the engineering. A circular tunnel is strong, but a sewer does not carry a constant volume of flow. In dry weather, it carries little. In storm, it carries a great deal. An egg-shaped section, narrower at the bottom and wider at the top, addresses this directly. The narrow lower channel concentrates the low dry weather flow so that it runs fast enough to carry its sediment and not silt up, while the wider upper section provides the capacity for storm flow when it comes. The shape is hydraulically intelligent, designed to be self-cleansing at low volume and capacious at high, and it is also structurally sound, the pointed lower section and the broad upper arch, together forming a profile that resists the surrounding clay's pressure efficiently from every direction. The Victorians did not arrive at the egg by accident. They arrived at it by reasoning carefully about flow and load together, and the result is a form that has performed both functions for more than a century and a half without fundamental failure. The construction of these tunnels through London clay followed a method that was laborious and exact. The clay was excavated by hand in the early works, or later by machine, and as the face advanced, the lining followed close behind, because the clay would stand unsupported only for a limited time before it began to move. The timing of the work was therefore a constant negotiation with the material, advancing far enough to make progress, but not so far that the unlined ground had time to deform. The brick lining was laid in rings, course upon course, buttered and keyed, and brought up to bear against the surrounding clay so that the structure and the ground were in continuous contact, the lining pressing out against the clay and the clay pressing in against the lining, the two locked in a balanced opposition that would hold for generations. The quality of the brickwork mattered enormously, because a weak point anywhere in the ring could become the place where the clay's pressure found purchase and began the slow work of failure. The Victorian bricklayers, working underground by lamplight in the wet, laid millions of bricks to a standard that has outlasted nearly everything built above them, and they did it because they understood that underground, with the patient clay pressing in on every side, there is no margin for the careless course. Modern tunnelling beneath London has refined the method without changing its fundamental logic. The boring machine that cut toward the plague grave at Farringdon was a vastly more sophisticated descendant of the Victorian hand excavation. A great cylindrical machine that cut the clay at its face, removed the spoil, and erected a lining of precast concrete segments behind itself as it advanced, all in a continuous coordinated operation. But the principle was identical. Substitute a structure for the load-bearing ground, install it before the clay can move, and build it strong enough to resist the slow geological push across its entire life. The technology changed. The relationship with the material did not. The clay is the same clay the Victorians fought and the Romans built upon, and it imposes the same demands on everyone who enters it, across every century, because the clay does not care what era is tunnelling through it. It responds to excavation the way it has always responded, with its patient swelling and its slow pressure and its impermeable grip, and the engineer's task is always the same task, only the tools differ. It is in this context that the decision to leave the plague dead undisturbed becomes not only a legal and economic choice but an engineering one. To excavate the burial ground fully would mean opening a large volume of the clay that currently holds it stable, relieving the pressure across that volume, and triggering exactly the swelling and movement that the engineering of the surrounding infrastructure has been designed to resist in its existing, undisturbed state. The plague grave is not merely an archaeological asset to be preserved. It is a part of the load-bearing ground, a volume of clay and its contents that the structures above and around it are quietly relying upon to stay where it is. Disturbing it would not just be expensive and legally fraught and ethically heavy. It would be a destabilization of the ground itself, an invitation to the clay to move, with consequences propagating outward into the foundations and tunnels and structures that have been built in equilibrium with the present arrangement. The dead are holding up the city as much as the city is sitting upon the dead. The seal is structural. This is the deepest sense in which the world beneath London is sealed, and it is worth stating plainly because it is the truest version of the title's promise. The grave is not locked behind a door that someone refuses to open. It is locked behind the physics of the ground, the law of the dead, the economics of disturbance, and the long erosion of memory, all of them pointing the same direction, all of them reinforcing the standing preference for leaving the ground exactly as it is. To open it, you would have to overcome the geology, the law, the cost, and the ethics simultaneously. And there is no reason compelling enough to do so because the grave threatens no one, blocks nothing essential, and yields, from a few licensed samples, everything science actually needs to know. The rational, lawful, economical, weird, and respectful course is the one that has been followed continuously since 1348. Contain it, record what little must be recorded, and leave the rest in the patient clay. The seal is not a conspiracy. It is a consensus, renewed by inaction, that the world beneath is best left as a world beneath, and the clay will keep it. That is the final flattening thought to rest on as we move deeper into the logistics of the buried city. Whatever the surface does, however many times it rebuilds itself, however many new tunnels thread the strata and new towers press their foundations down toward Rome, the clay beneath will go on doing what it has done since before the city existed. It will hold the dead in their orderly rows. It will press against the vaulted rivers and the brick sewers and the concrete tunnels with the same slow patience. It will preserve, in its dense impermeable grip, the genetic record in the sealed teeth and the timber in the medieval foundations and the tile in the Roman floors, all of it held still, all of it legible to anyone who ever has reason and authority to read it, and none of it disturbed because there is no reason and rarely the authority. The city above changes constantly. The world below changes almost not at all. The clay sees to that. The sewers beneath London did not arise from foresight. They arose from disaster, and the disaster is worth recounting in the patient register of this part of the story because it explains why the buried infrastructure beneath the city has the character it does. For most of its history, London disposed of its waste the way every city did, which is to say carelessly and locally, into cesspits beneath houses, into the gutters of the streets, and ultimately into the rivers, the Fleet and the Tyburn, and the rest, which carried it down to the Thames. The Thames received the accumulated filth of a growing population, and, being tidal, did not so much remove it as slosh it back and forth, concentrating the waste of the city in the very water that ran through its heart. As the population grew across the centuries, the volume of waste grew with it, and the rivers that had once been adequate to carry it became, one by one, the open sewers we have already descended into, fouled beyond use and increasingly enclosed precisely because they had become intolerable to be near. The crisis reached its breaking point in the middle of the 19th century, when the combination of a vast and growing population, the increasing use of water closets that flushed far more liquid waste into the system than the old cesspits had handled, and a series of hot summers produced a condition in the Thames so foul that it overwhelmed the institutions of government themselves. The river beside the seat of government became, in the worst of it, an open channel of barely diluted sewage, and the stench that rose from it was severe enough to disrupt the business of the legislature directly, to drive the work of the nation indoors and behind soaked curtains in a futile attempt to keep the smell at bay. It is one of the few instances in which a sanitary crisis struck the governing class as directly as it struck the poor, and the result was that those in authority, for once, acted. The decision was taken to build a comprehensive drainage system for the entire city, a single coordinated network that would intercept the waste before it reached the river and carry it far downstream to be discharged where it would not return. The system that resulted was among the largest engineering undertakings of its age, and its logic was elegant in its simplicity, even as its execution was enormous in its scale. The principle was interception. Rather than allowing the waste of the city to flow down its natural gradient into the Thames at the centre, a series of great intercepting sewers was built to run roughly parallel to the river, catching the flow from the older drains and the buried rivers as it descended and diverting it sideways, eastward, away from the populated core, to be carried far downstream before release. The buried rivers, the Fleet and the Tyburn and the Walbrook were folded into this system, their flows intercepted and redirected, so that the streams which had once carried the city's waste into its heart now fed into the great interceptors that carried it away. The lost rivers became, in their final demotion, mere tributaries of the sewer network, their ancient courses repurposed as components of a machine designed to undo the very pollution they had once delivered. The construction of the intercepting sewers required tunnelling and cut-and-cover excavation across the entire breadth of the city, through the same London clay that holds the plague dead, against the same swelling pressure and the same demands for permanence. The work consumed an immense quantity of brick, manufactured specifically for the purpose to a standard capable of resisting the corrosive contents and the geological load, and it employed a workforce of thousands across years of labour. The engineers laid out the network with careful attention to gradient, because the system was to run by gravity wherever possible, the waste flowing downhill along sewers pitched at precise and gentle slopes, fast enough to stay self-cleansing but not so fast as to require unnecessary depth. Where gravity could not carry the flow far enough, great pumping stations were built to lift it, monumental structures housing engines of enormous power. And these too were built with a permanence and even a decorative grandeur that seems extraordinary for buildings dedicated to the movement of sewage, as though the engineers wished to dignify the unglamorous work with architecture worthy of its importance. The completion of this system transformed the city, and it did so largely invisibly, which is the recurring theme of everything buried beneath London. The surface saw cleaner streets and a cleaner river and an end to the worst of the stench, but the machine that produced these results ran entirely underground, out of sight, in the brick tunnels and the buried river courses and the pumping stations, doing its continuous work without the population above needing to understand or even acknowledge it. The sewer system joined the lost rivers and the plague dead in the category of things sealed beneath the city and forgotten by it, things that the surface relies upon utterly while thinking about them not at all. The difference is only that the sewers are maintained actively by people whose job is to keep the buried machine running, whereas the dead are maintained by nothing but the clay. But all of them share the condition of being essential and invisible, present and unregarded, the buried foundation of a surface life that proceeds in ignorance of what holds it up. The maintenance of the sewers is itself a buried world worth pausing on, because it is one of the few parts of the underground that human beings still routinely enter. The tunnels require inspection and clearing, because despite their self-cleansing design, they accumulate deposits over time, the slow sedimentation of a city's waste, and in places these deposits congeal into masses that must be physically removed. There are workers whose occupation is the descent into these tunnels, the navigation of the brick passages in the dark and the wet, the inspection of the Victorian brickwork for the first signs of the failure that the clay is always slowly working toward, and the removal of the accumulated obstructions before they grow large enough to block the flow. These workers move through a hidden architecture that almost no one else ever sees, the egg-shaped tunnels and the junctions and the buried river courses, a parallel city of brick and water beneath the city of stone and glass, and they maintain it precisely so that the surface can continue to ignore it. They are the custodians of one part of the sealed world, the part that cannot be left entirely to the clay because it must keep functioning, and their work is the exception that proves the rule. The underground is entered only where it must be, and only by those whose job requires it, and otherwise it is left sealed and dark and undisturbed. Everything we have descended through connects, in the end, through the medium of water and the medium of clay. The buried rivers carry water through the strata. The clay holds the water back and channels it and preserves what it touches. The sewers manage the water and the waste and intercept the buried rivers. The plague dead lie in the waterlogged clay that the impermeability of the same clay keeps stable. The Roman foundations and the medieval layers and the Victorian brick all sit within and upon the clay, all subject to its slow pressure, all sealed by its grip. The underground of London is not a collection of separate buried things. It is a single integrated structure, layered and threaded and locked together, in which the dead and the rivers and the sewers and the ancient walls all occupy their places in a stack that the surface city rests upon, without comprehension. To descend through it, as we have been doing, is to read the city's entire history backward and downward, from the present at the top to Rome at the bottom, and to understand that every layer was sealed by the one above it in the ordinary course of a city that has only ever known how to build by burying. The modern law that governs the disturbance of human remains is the direct inheritor of the medieval framework we traced earlier, but it has acquired over the intervening centuries a secular architecture layered on top of the ecclesiastical one, and the combination is what makes the disturbance of a place like the Charterhouse Square burial ground so heavily constrained. Where the medieval rule rested on the sanctity of consecrated ground and the religious obligation owed to the dead, the modern rule rests additionally on statute, on public health considerations, on the licensing power of the state, and on a body of practice developed specifically for the situation that arises constantly in a city built upon its own past, the situation in which development needs ground that the dead already occupy. The law did not abolish the old protections. It formalized and extended them, translating the religious presumption against disturbance into a procedural regime that any disturbance must navigate. The central feature of that regime is that the disturbance of buried human remains requires lawful authority obtained in advance, and that authority is granted only on conditions designed to ensure that the remains are treated with dignity throughout. A developer who discovers, or expects to discover, human remains on a site cannot simply proceed. The remains must be dealt with under a license, the work must be conducted according to specified standards, the remains must be carefully exhumed, rather than crudely cleared, recorded, and reinterred or otherwise disposed of according to the terms of the authority granted. The process is deliberate, and it is slow and it is expensive because it involves specialists, archaeological supervision, the careful handling of each set of remains, and the navigation of a procedure that is intentionally weighted toward caution and respect rather than speed. The law makes the disturbance of the dead difficult on purpose, because the alternative, a world in which the dead could be cleared casually for convenience, is one that neither the religious tradition nor the secular conscience that succeeded it is willing to accept. This is the procedural reality behind the phrase preservation in situ, and it is worth understanding that the phrase describes not a single decision, but the rational endpoint of a whole structure of incentives. When a developer or an infrastructure project encounters a burial ground, the law presents two broad paths. One is full excavation under license, with all the cost and time and procedural weight that entails, followed by reinterment, a path appropriate when the ground genuinely must be cleared because something essential is to be built precisely there. The other is to avoid disturbing the remains at all, to design the works so that they pass around or above or below the burial ground rather than through it, leaving the dead in place and untouched, recording only what is unavoidably exposed at the margins. Faced with these two paths, and with a burial ground that is not strictly in the way of anything that cannot be routed around it, the rational choice is almost always the second. It is cheaper, faster, less fraught, and more respectful. Preservation in situ is not chosen because someone forbids excavation. It is chosen because every incentive the law creates points toward leaving the dead alone. The Crossrail works at Farringdon followed exactly this logic. The railway needed to pass through the area, but it did not need to pass through the entire burial ground, and so the works were designed to take what little ground they unavoidably required, and to leave the overwhelming bulk of the burials undisturbed. The 25 skeletons lifted from the first trench were lifted because they lay precisely where the works had to go, and they were lifted under license, were recorded, studied, and ultimately reinterred with appropriate ceremony, the modern regime observing toward these medieval dead the same care that the medieval regime had observed when it buried them. The thousands that lay beyond the line of the works were left where they were, sealed back into the clay, preserved in situ, because there was no need to disturb them and every reason not to. The encounter between the railway and the grave was managed, in other words, by the law working exactly as designed, channeling an enormous infrastructure project around an ancient burial ground, with the loss of as few of the dead as possible, and the disturbance of as little of the ground as the engineering allowed. It is this regime, operating continuously and by default, that constitutes the modern seal on the world beneath London. There is no single guardian, no locked door, no authority actively forbidding access. There is instead a structure of law and incentive and practice that makes disturbance the exceptional course and preservation the ordinary one, that requires anyone who wishes to open the ground to justify it against a presumption that the ground should stay closed, and that ensures through the simple operation of cost and procedure and conscience that the dead are left alone in all but the cases where they cannot be. The seal is administrative and economic and ethical, distributed across the whole apparatus of how the city manages its development, and it is all the more durable for being distributed, because there is no single point at which it could be undone. To open the world beneath London, you would have to overcome not a guard but a consensus, and the consensus is held in place by the weight of everything we have described: the law of the dead, the cost of disturbance, the patient pressure of the clay, and the long indifference of a surface that has forgotten what lies beneath it. And so the dead remain, in their orderly medieval rows, in the cold preserving clay, beneath the financial district that does not know they are there. The rivers remain, in their brick vaults running in the dark beneath the streets that bear no sign of them. The sewers remain, maintained in their hidden tunnels by the few who descend to keep the buried machine running. The Roman wall remains in its fragments, deep beneath the modern plan it still faintly dictates, all of it sealed, all of it layered, all of it held in the patient grip of the clay and the patient weight of the law and the patient erosion of memory. A whole world beneath the city, recorded where it had to be recorded, and otherwise left entirely undisturbed, frozen in the ground in the order in which the centuries laid it down. The surface goes on above, rebuilding itself constantly, walking its daily routes across the lid of all of it, and the world beneath goes on existing in the dark, sealed and forgotten, and almost entirely undisturbed, exactly as it has existed since the year the grave was dug. Let us go deeper still into the logistics, because the deeper we go, the more the city's relationship with its own foundation reveals itself, and thus more clearly the seal shows itself to be not a single act, but a permanent condition of the place. Consider the Underground Railway, the deep network of tunnels that carries the modern city's millions through the clay every day. It is, in a sense, the most ambitious intrusion ever made into the buried world. A vast system of bored tunnels threading the strata at depths that pass beneath the medieval and Roman layers entirely, running through the clay below the level at which the dead and the rivers and the ancient walls sit. And yet even this enormous intrusion is, in its own way, a confirmation of the seal rather than a breach of it, because the tunnels were threaded with extraordinary care, precisely to avoid disturbing what they passed near, routed and rerouted to thread between the known hazards, to slip beneath a foundation here and around a buried structure there, to take the path that disturbed the least. The planning of an underground railway line beneath a city as densely layered as London is, an exercise in negotiation with the buried world that the public never sees. Before a single tunnel is bored, the route must be assessed against everything known to lie in its path. And in central London, that means a great deal. The foundations of every substantial building above, the existing tunnels of the older lines, the buried rivers in their vaults, the sewers in their brick, the utility tunnels carrying cables and pipes, the documented archaeological sites, and the burial grounds, whose locations are recorded even where their contents have not been disturbed. The route is drawn to avoid the worst of these, to pass beneath the foundations at a depth that does not undermine them, to keep clear of the buried rivers, to thread between the existing tunnels with margins calculated to prevent one excavation from destabilizing another. The map the planners work from is a three-dimensional record of the buried city, incomplete and cautious and constantly revised, and the line they draw upon it is a line of least disturbance, a path chosen to add the new layer with the minimum violence to the old. When such a line passes near a known burial ground, the calculation becomes especially careful, because the law and the engineering and the ethics all converge on the same imperative: do not disturb the dead if you can possibly avoid it. The tunnel is routed to pass below the burials, or to one side of them, deep in the clay beneath the level at which the bodies lie, so that the boring machine passes through ground that holds no remains, and the burials above are left undisturbed in their stratum. This is possible because the dead, in a place like the Charterhouse Square ground, occupy a relatively shallow layer a few metres down cut into the upper clay, while the deep railway tunnels run far below that, threading the clay at depths the medieval gravediggers never reached. The new layer is added beneath the old one, and the old one is left sealed above it, and the two coexist in the stratified ground without the lower disturbing the upper. The underground does not breach the seal, it slips beneath it. And where a line cannot avoid a burial ground, where the works must pass through the ground that holds the dead, the full apparatus of the modern regime engages: the license, the archaeological supervision, the careful exhumation, the recording, the reinterment. This is what happened at the margins of the Crossrail works, where the line clipped the edge of the burial ground and the dead in its precise path had to be lifted. The lifting was done according to the regime, with care and record and ceremony, and it was kept to the absolute minimum that the engineering required, because every body lifted is a cost and a delay and an ethical weight, and the incentive at every step is to lift as few as possible. The result is that even where the seal is breached, it is breached as narrowly as it can be, that's works taking only what they cannot avoid and leaving everything else sealed in place. The breach is a pinhole, not a door, and the world beyond the pinhole remains as undisturbed as it was before. This pattern of the new layer added with minimum disturbance to the old, of the seal breached only as narrowly as necessity demands, repeats at every scale and in every era of the city's building. It is the pattern of the deep tunnels threading beneath the burials. It is the pattern of the foundations of new towers, driven down through the upper layers to bear on the deep clay or the bedrock below, designed to carry their enormous loads to a stable stratum while passing through the archaeology above with the least possible damage. It is the patterns of every utility trench, every basement, every excavation, all of them governed by the same imperative to take what is needed and disturb no more, all of them adding to the buried stack while leaving the existing layers as intact as the work allows. The city grows by accretion, layer upon layer, each new layer threading carefully through and around and beneath the old, and the cumulative result is the deeply stratified, densely sealed underground that we have been descending through. A structure built not by any single plan, but by the endless repetition of the same cautious imperative across 2,000 years. The foundations of the great modern buildings deserve their own slow consideration, because they are the deepest deliberate intrusions the surface city makes into the buried world, and they reveal the same logic of careful avoidance that governs everything else. A tall building imposes an enormous load on the ground beneath it, a load that must be carried down to a stratum capable of bearing it, and in central London that means driving foundations deep into the clay, sometimes to great depth, to reach ground stable and strong enough to support the structure above. The engineering of these foundations is a study in the behaviour of the clay under concentrated load, in the way the deep clay carries weight, in the settlement that must be predicted and accommodated as the building's mass presses down over the years. And in the course of driving these foundations, the builders pass through the upper layers, through the made ground and the medieval accumulation, and, where it is present, the archaeology and the burials, and here again the regime engages, the work supervised, the finds recorded, the remains were unavoidably disturbed handled according to the law. But the striking thing is how often even these deep foundations manage to avoid the worst disturbances, because the planning takes the buried world into account from the start. A building's foundations can be arranged, within limits, to bear on the ground between the known hazards, to place the load-bearing piles where they will pass through ground that holds nothing of consequence, and to avoid driving them through a burial ground or a buried structure where another arrangement is possible. The design is a negotiation between the load the building imposes and the buried world it must pass through, and a good design minimises the conflict, places the foundations where they do the least harm to what lies below, and adds the new structure to the stack with the least disturbance to the old. The deep foundations of modern London are threaded through the buried world with the same care as the deep tunnels, and the same imperative governs both. Take what the engineering requires, disturb no more, and leave the sealed world sealed wherever the work allows. We have spoken of the 1348 burials as though they were a single event, a one-time catastrophe that filled a field and was done, but the truth is slower and more relentless than that, and it deepens the strangeness of what lies beneath the city. The plague did not come once, it came in waves, returning to London again and again across more than 3 centuries, each return bringing its own surge of death, each surge requiring its own ground, each filling of the ground adding another layer to the buried record of the city's recurring agony. The 1348 outbreak was the first and the most catastrophic, the one that emptied perhaps half the city in a matter of months, but it was followed by return after return, decade after decade, generation after generation, the disease receding and then coming back, never quite leaving for long enough to be forgotten before it arrived again. Each return posed the same problem the first had posed: where to put the dead when the ordinary ground was full or insufficient. And each return was met with the same kind of response: the acquisition or reuse of burial ground, the digging of trenches, the layered interment of the dead according to the form. Over the long span of the plague centuries, this meant that some burial grounds received the dead not once but repeatedly, layer upon layer, the trenches of one outbreak cut above or beside the trenches of an earlier one, the ground accumulating its dead in successive strata that record the successive visitations of the disease. To excavate such a ground fully would be to read the entire history of the plague in London, written in layers of bone, the deepest and oldest at the bottom, the later returns stacked above. A stratigraphy of recurring death that no document captures as completely as the ground itself. This layering within the burial grounds mirrors the layering of the city above them, and it is part of why the buried world is so dense and so difficult to disturb. A burial ground that received the dead across multiple outbreaks is not a simple single deposit, but a complex accumulation. Its layers interleaved, its trenches overlapping, its record of death built up over centuries in the same way the city's record of life was built up above it. The clay holds all of it, the early dead and the later dead, the first catastrophe and the recurring returns, in the same preserving grip, and the modern reluctance to disturb it is reluctance to disturb not one grave but many, not one moment but a long span of the city's history compressed into the ground. The seal covers not a single event but an era, the whole long age of the plague, sealed in the clay beneath the surface that has forgotten all of it equally. The recurrence of the plague also shaped the law and the practice of burial in ways that endured. The repeated need for emergency burial ground, the repeated overwhelming of the parish churchyards, the repeated acquisition and consecration of new ground, all of this became, over the plague centuries, a familiar if dreaded routine. A thing the city knew how to do because it had done it so many times. The administrative machinery for creating burial ground at speed, the legal mechanisms for acquiring and consecrating land under pressure, the practical methods for interring the dead in volume, all of it was refined through repetition, passed down and improved across the generations that faced the returning disease. The city became, in a grim sense, expert at burying its dead in catastrophic numbers, and the expertise is visible in the organisation of the burial grounds, in the efficiency of the trenches, in the maintenance of the form even under the worst load. The dead beneath London were buried by a civilization that had learned through bitter and repeated experience exactly how to bury its dead when the dying came faster than the ground could ordinarily absorb. And then, eventually, the plague left. The last great outbreak in London came in the 17th century, a final catastrophic visitation that filled the burial grounds one last time, and after it the disease retreated from the city and did not return in that form. The reasons for its departure are debated and complex and not fully understood, but the effect on the buried world was simple. The burial grounds stopped receiving the plague dead, the trenches were filled for the last time, and the long accumulation of plague burials beneath the city came to an end. The grounds passed into the same limbo that the 1348 field had entered. Disused but consecrated, protected but forgotten, gradually absorbed into the expanding city as the memory of what they held thinned and faded across the generations that followed. The plague centuries ended, and their dead were sealed in the clay, and the city above moved on into a future in which the great recurring catastrophe of its past became first a memory, then a story, then a line in the records, then nothing at all to the people walking the streets above the trenches. The transition from a city that buried its plague dead to a city that had forgotten them was the work of centuries, and it is worth tracing in the patient register of this part of the story, because it is the mechanism by which a sealed world becomes a forgotten one, and it is the same mechanism we saw at work in the single field at Charterhouse Square, operating now across the whole buried apparatus of the plague centuries. The people who had buried the last of the plague dead died in their turn and were buried in their turn, in ordinary graves in ordinary times, and the knowledge of where the plague dead lay passed to their children and then to their children's children, growing fainter with each transmission. The burial grounds, no longer receiving the dead, ceased to be active places and became merely old places, ground with a history that fewer and fewer people remembered. The city, growing and pressing outward, encroached upon them, built at their edges, eventually built across them, and the building was done by people who did not know or did not think about what lay beneath, because the knowledge had thinned past the point where it shaped behaviour. By the time the modern city rose, the plague dead beneath it had become, for all practical purposes, invisible, present in the ground but absent from the mind, recorded in documents that specialists might consult but that the ordinary life of the city never touched. The financial district was built above ground that held the dead of the city's worst centuries, and it was built by people who did not think of the dead at all, because the dead had passed entirely out of the living awareness of the place. This is the deepest and quietest form of the seal of forgetting, which requires no law and no engineering and no cost to maintain, because it maintains itself through the simple operation of time on memory. The dead were sealed not only in the clay and behind the law, but behind the oblivion of a city that had genuinely forgotten they were there, and their forgetting was the most complete seal of all, until a boring machine cut into the edge of it and reminded the city briefly of what its foundations had always held. We have reached the bottom of the descent, or nearly so, and at the bottom is Rome, and Rome deserves the slow attention this part of the story can give it, because the Roman city is the floor on which everything else was built, and its presence beneath the modern street is the oldest and in some ways the strangest layer of the sealed world. London began as Londinium, a Roman foundation established nearly 2,000 years ago at a crossing point of the Thames, and the Romans built it in the manner they built everywhere, with stone and brick and tile, with planned streets and substantial buildings, with the engineering confidence of a civilization that built to last. When the Roman period ended and the city declined, the Roman buildings did not vanish. They fell into ruin, they were robbed for their stone, they were built over and buried, but their foundations remained in the ground, and there they remain there still, the deepest deliberate human layer beneath the modern surface. The Roman wall is the most substantial survival, and its story is a long demonstration of how the buried world shapes the surface long after it has been forgotten. The Romans built a great defensive wall around their city, a circuit of stone enclosing the urban area, and this wall was so substantial, so well built that it endured for centuries after the Romans left, defining the boundary of the medieval city that grew up within its line. The medieval city did not build a new wall in a new place. It used and repaired and built upon the Roman wall, because the Roman wall was there and was strong and defined the defensible area. And because the medieval city grew within the Roman line, the streets and the property boundaries and the whole plan of the medieval city were shaped by the Roman wall, and because the modern city inherited the medieval plan, the modern street pattern in parts of the old city still faintly echoes the line of a wall built 2,000 years ago by an empire that has been gone for 15 centuries. The wall is mostly buried now, surviving in fragments, some displayed, most hidden in foundations and basements, but its influence persists in the shape of the streets above it, a buried structure still dictating the surface long after everyone who knew what it was has died. The Roman layer beneath the city is not only the wall, it is the foundations of buildings, the lines of streets, the remains of the infrastructure of a Roman provincial capital, all of it buried beneath the accumulated layers of the 18 centuries since. When modern excavation reaches this depth, which it does only where the works go deep enough, it encounters the Roman city in fragments. A piece of wall here, a foundation there, a stretch of Roman street surface, the buried floor of the original city. And the same regime that governs the burial grounds governs these Roman remains. They are recorded where they are exposed, protected where they can be, and disturbed only as much as the works unavoidably require. The Roman layer is sealed beneath the medieval layer is sealed beneath the modern layer, each protecting and preserving the one below it through the simple fact of lying on top of it. The whole stack held in the clay, the deepest and oldest at the bottom, the Roman floor on which the entire subsequent history of the city was built. To stand in the modern city and consider what lies beneath is to consider this entire stack at once, the surface of the present moment, the modern services beneath it, the Victorian brick of the sewers and the buried rivers, the medieval accumulation with its plague trenches cut into the clay, and at the bottom the Roman foundations, the original floor. 2,000 years of the city compressed into a few meters of ground, each layer sealed by the one above, each preserved by the indifference and the inertia and the law that kept it from being disturbed, the whole of it held in the clay that underlies everything. The modern city walks upon all of it, builds carefully through it, threads its tunnels beneath it, and otherwise leaves it sealed and dark and undisturbed. A buried world of extraordinary depth and density beneath the thin, bright surface of the living city. And the clay holds all of it equally. This is the thought to rest on as the descent reaches its bottom, and we prepare to climb slowly back toward the surface. The clay does not distinguish between the Roman foundation and the medieval grave and the Victorian sewer. It presses against all of them with the same slow patience, preserves all of them with the same impermeable grip, holds all of them in the same dense stillness. The dead of 1348 and the dead of the later plague centuries and the foundations of Londinium and the brick of the great sewers all lie in the same clay, subject to the same forces, sealed by the same conditions, indifferent to the eras that separate them because the clay is indifferent to time. The buried world is not a sequence of separate things from separate ages. It is a single mass of preserved history held in a single preserving medium, and the medium is the clay, and the clay will hold it for as long as the clay exists, which is to say effectively forever on any scale a human mind can grasp. Now we begin the slow climb back. We leave the Roman floor and rise through the medieval layers, past the plague trenches in their clay, the orderly rows of the dead still lying where they were placed in the city's worst years, sealed and recorded, and otherwise undisturbed. We rise past the level of the buried rivers, the Fleet and the Tyburn still flowing in their dark brick vaults, carrying their water down toward the Thames as they have for thousands of years, demoted to infrastructure, sealed beneath the streets, maintained in the dark by the few whose job requires it. We rise past the Victorian brick of the great sewers, the egg-shaped tunnels still carrying the city's waste. The buried machine still running, still maintained, still doing its continuous invisible work beneath the surface that relies upon it without thought. We rise through the modern services, the dense, nervous system of cables and pipes threaded through the first meters below the street, and we reach at last the surface, the thin, bright skin of the present moment, the asphalt and the paving constantly relayed, the one layer the city refuses to let age. And here is the strangeness to leave you with, in the flat and patient register that this hour has settled into. The surface of the city is the thinnest possible thing. It is a few centimeters of the present moment laid over 2,000 years of buried history, a bright temporary skin over a vast and ancient and densely sealed underworld. The people who walk the surface walk upon all of it, the Roman foundations and the plague dead and the buried rivers and the Victorian sewers, and they do it without thinking about it, because to think about it constantly would be unbearable, and because the seal of forgetting is the most complete seal of all. The buried world is real, and it is there beneath every step, and it is sealed not by any conspiracy, but by the patient operation of clay and law and cost and time, the four great forces that keep the world beneath the city sealed and dark and undisturbed. The surface changes constantly. The world beneath changes almost not at all, and the gap between them, the few meters of clay that separate the bright temporary present from the vast sealed past, is the thinnest and most easily forgotten boundary in the entire city. It is worth returning now in the slowest and most patient register the script will reach to the chemistry of the clay itself, because the chemistry is the final layer of explanation beneath everything we have described, and it is the most monotone and the most calming, which makes it the right material for the deepest part of the sleep phase. London clay is composed of fine mineral particles, the products of ancient weathering and deposition, settled out of a long-vanished sea over a span of time so vast it resists ordinary comprehension. The particles are small, far smaller than the grains of sand, and they are flat, plate-like in shape. And this shape and size give the clay its characteristic behaviour, its cohesion, its impermeability, its capacity to hold water and to hold its shape and to hold, across the centuries, whatever is buried within it. The impermeability comes from the smallness and the packing of the particles. Water moves through soil by passing through the spaces between the particles, and in a coarse soil like sand or gravel, these spaces are large and connected, and water passes through readily. In clay, the spaces between the tiny plate-like particles are minute, and the water that occupies them is held tightly by the surfaces of the particles themselves, bound in thin films that do not flow freely. Water moves through clay only very slowly, over long spans of time, which is why the clay can hold back a buried river, and why it keeps the buried dead in a stable waterlogged environment rather than allowing the water to drain through and the air to enter. The slowness of water movement through clay is measured in geological rather than human time, and it means that the conditions within a deep clay deposit are extraordinarily stable, changing only over spans far longer than the centuries the dead have lain there. This stability is the key to the preservation. Decay, the breakdown of organic material after death, is driven by the activity of microorganisms, and those microorganisms require oxygen and moisture and a supply of the materials they consume. In the deep clay, oxygen is almost entirely absent, because the clay's impermeability prevents air from penetrating, and without oxygen, the ordinary processes of decay cannot proceed. The microorganisms that break down a body in ordinary soil cannot live in the oxygen-poor depths of the clay, and so the breakdown that would, in ordinary ground, reduce a body to nothing, across a few decades is, in the clay, slowed almost to a stop. The bones survive, the teeth survive, the sealed genetic record within the teeth survives, all of it held in a chemical environment so stable and so hostile to decay that it preserves the dead across centuries that would, in any other ground, have erased them entirely. The clay is a preservative because it is impermeable, and it is impermeable because of the smallness and the packing and the shape of its particles, and this is the chemistry beneath the seal. The same chemistry that preserves the dead preserves everything else in the buried world. The timber of medieval foundations, which would rot to nothing in ordinary aerated soil, survives in the waterlogged oxygen-poor clay, preserved by the same absence of decay that preserves the bones. The leather and the wood and the organic materials that archaeologists recover from deep London excavations survive, because the clay held them in conditions where decay could not proceed. The clay is a vast preservative medium, and the buried world it holds is preserved to a degree that would be impossible in any other ground, which is part of why the archaeology of London is so rich and why the surface city sits upon such a dense and well-preserved record of its own past. The clay does not merely hold the buried world, it keeps it in a state of arrested decay, legible across spans of time that would elsewhere have reduced it to nothing. And the clay's stability extends to its mechanical behaviour as well, to the slow swelling and the patient pressure we described earlier, which operate on the same geological timescale as the movement of water through the particles. The clay does not change quickly. It does not shift or settle or move in ways that a human observer would notice within a human lifetime. Its swelling against a tunnel lining, its pressure against a buried structure, its slow attempt to reclaim an excavated space, all of these proceed over decades and centuries, slowly enough that a well-built structure can resist them for generations, slowly enough that the buried world remains stable and undisturbed across the long spans of time during which it lies sealed. The clay is patient in every respect, in its chemistry and in its mechanics, in its preservation of the dead and in its pressure against the living city's intrusions, and the patience is the deepest reason the sealed world stays sealed and stable and preserved across the centuries. Consider in this slow and patient register the grid systems by which the medieval burial grounds were organised, because the organisation is part of what the clay preserved and part of what the excavation revealed. and it is the kind of exhaustive logistical detail that this part of the story can dwell upon at length. The trenches were not dug at random. They were laid out in an organised pattern, a grid of parallel cuts into the consecrated ground, each trench a defined space into which the dead were placed in order. The grid allowing the maximum use of the available ground and the orderly progression of the burials as the trenches were filled one by one. The grid was a practical response to the problem of organising a mass burial, a way of imposing order on the volume of death, of ensuring that the ground was used efficiently and that the burials proceeded in a controlled and recorded manner rather than in chaos. Within each trench, the dead were placed in layers, separated by partings of soil, the bodies laid out in their rows in the correct orientation, layer upon layer until the trench was full. The layering allowed each trench to hold many times the number of dead a single layer would have permitted, multiplying the capacity of the consecrated ground, and the partings of soil between the layers kept the burials organised and distinct even within the dense stack. This was an engineered solution to the problem of capacity, a way of fitting the maximum number of dead into the minimum of consecrated ground, while maintaining the order and the form that the burial of the faithful demanded. The grid of trenches and the layering within them together constituted a system, a logistics of mass burial developed under the pressure of catastrophic death, and the system is visible in the archaeology, in the parallel trenches and the layered bodies and bins and the consistent orientation, the buried evidence of a civilization organising its dead with the same care it organised everything else. The records of these burials, where they survive, complement the archaeology, and the relationship between the records and the ground is part of how the buried world is known. The medieval habit of documentation meant that the creation and use of burial grounds generated records, the deeds of acquisition, the registers of consecration, sometimes the accounts of the burials themselves, and these records, preserved in archives across the centuries, allow the modern investigator to reconstruct the existence and location and history of burial grounds that lie sealed in the ground. The records are incomplete, scattered, sometimes ambiguous, but they are real, and they preserve in writing what the clay preserves in physical form. The two records complementing each other, the documentary and the archaeological, the written and the buried, together constituting the knowledge of the sealed world that allows it to be located and understood without being disturbed. The reconstruction of a sealed burial ground from records and from the limited evidence of marginal excavation is a careful and patient discipline, and it is worth describing in detail because it is the means by which the modern city knows what lies beneath it without opening the ground. The investigator begins with the documents, the surviving records of acquisition and consecration and use, which establish that a burial ground existed, roughly where it lay, and roughly when it received its dead. The documents are then matched against the modern landscape, the recorded locations interpreted in terms of the present streets and buildings, the approximate boundaries of the old burial ground projected onto the modern map. This is rarely precise because the medieval records did not use modern coordinates and the landscape has changed beyond recognition, but it is enough to identify the general area where a burial ground lay and to flag it as a place where the dead are likely to be encountered if the ground is ever disturbed. The documentary reconstruction is then tested and refined by whatever physical evidence becomes available, and the physical evidence usually comes from the margins, from the excavations that clip the edge of a burial ground in the course of works directed at something else. When a trench for a building or a tunnel or a utility passes through the edge of a recorded burial ground, it exposes a small section of the burials, and that section confirms and refines the documentary reconstruction, establishing the actual depth of the burials, the density of the dead, the orientation of the bodies, the layering of the trenches. The Crossrail works at Charterhouse Square were exactly such a marginal exposure, a clipping of the edge of a burial ground that confirmed and refined what the documents had suggested, and that yielded, from its small licensed sample, the scientific record that we have discussed. The combination of the documentary reconstruction and the marginal physical evidence allows the burial ground to be known with reasonable confidence without being fully excavated, which is precisely the outcome the regime is designed to produce. Knowledge without disturbance, understanding without opening, the sealed world mapped and comprehended while remaining sealed. This is the equilibrium that the modern city has reached with the buried world beneath it, and it is a stable equilibrium, self-maintaining, durable across the generations. The buried world is known well enough to be avoided, mapped well enough to be threaded through, understood well enough that the surface city can build above and around and beneath it without unnecessary disturbance, and it is left, by every incentive and every law and every practical consideration, as undisturbed as the building of the surface city allows. The equilibrium is not the product of any decision to preserve the buried world. It is the product of the countless small decisions made continuously across the generations, each of them choosing the path of least disturbance because that path is cheaper and faster and more lawful and more respectful than the alternative. The cumulative result of all these small decisions is the preservation of the buried world, the maintenance of the seal, the keeping of the sealed city beneath the living one, achieved not by intention but by the steady operation of incentive across time, and so the equilibrium holds, and the buried world remains, and the surface city goes on above it, and the gap between them remains the thin and easily forgotten boundary it has always been. The plague dead lie in their trenches in the clay, sealed and recorded and undisturbed. The buried rivers flow in their vaults, demoted and forgotten, and maintained. The Victorian sewers carry their flow in their egg-shaped tunnels, essential and invisible and tended by the few. The Roman foundations lie at the bottom, the original floor shaping the surface they no longer support. All of it held in the clay, all of it preserved by the chemistry and the impermeability and the stability of the deep deposit, all of it sealed by the convergent forces of law and cost and engineering and forgetting. The world beneath London is a vast and ancient and densely preserved thing, and it lies beneath the bright temporary surface of the present, sealed and dark and patient, exactly as it has lain for as long as there has been a city above it. To live in such a city, above such a buried world, is to live in a kind of unknowing that is the only sane way to live, because the alternative, a constant awareness of the dead and the drowned and the buried beneath every step, would be unbearable. And the surface city protects itself from that awareness through the seal of forgetting, the most complete and effortless of all the seals. The people who walk the streets of the financial district do not think of the plague dead beneath them, and this is right and necessary, because they could not function if they did. The seal of forgetting is not a failure of memory, but a condition of life, a necessary unknowing that allows the surface to proceed without being crushed by the weight of what it stands upon. The buried world is sealed behind forgetting, because the living could not bear to remember it constantly, and the forgetting is therefore not a loss but a mercy, a protection, a necessary distance between the bright surface and the dark depth. There is, in the end, a strange and quiet dignity to the way the city has dealt with its dead and its rivers and its ancient flaws, a dignity that emerges precisely from the indifference and the inertia and the forgetting. The dead were not desecrated. They were sealed, preserved, left in peace, recorded where they had to be recorded, and otherwise undisturbed, and the leaving was a kind of respect, even where it was motivated by cost and convenience rather than reverence. The rivers were not destroyed. They were demoted and contained and kept flowing, their courses preserved even as their visibility was taken away, and the keeping was a kind of continuity, even where it was motivated by sanitation rather than care. The Roman floor was not erased. It was built upon and preserved beneath, its influence persisting in the shape of the streets even as its substance was buried, and the persistence was a kind of memory even when no one remembered. The buried world was sealed, but it was sealed gently, preserved rather than destroyed, kept rather than erased, and the keeping is the quiet dignity at the bottom of the whole long story. And the clay holds it all, with its patient impermeable grip across the centuries, indifferent to time, preserving the dead and the rivers and the foundations in the same stable stillness, the same arrested decay, the same dark and silent permanence. The surface city changes and rebuilds and forgets, constantly, ceaselessly, the bright temporary skin of the present re-allayed again and again over the unchanging depth. But the world beneath does not change. It lies in the clay, sealed and preserved and patient, the plague dead in their orderly rows, the rivers in their dark vaults, the sewers in their brick, the Roman floor at the bottom, all of it held in the deep stable clay that has underlain the city since before the city existed, and will underlie it long after the present surface has itself become another buried layer in the endless accumulation. The clay was here first, the clay will be here last, and the clay holds, in its patient grip, the entire sealed world beneath London, exactly as it has held it across all the centuries, waiting in the dark, undisturbed. To understand why the ground at Charterhouse Square could be bought, blessed, filled, and sealed in the space of a single terrible year, you have to understand the law that governed the dead in medieval England, and that law was not a single statute but a slow accumulation of custom, canon, and obligation that had been settling into place for centuries before the plague arrived to test it. The acquisition of land in 14th century England proceeded through a body of law and custom of remarkable complexity, and to understand how a field became a consecrated burial ground in the crisis of 1348, you have to understand in patient detail the ordinary machinery that was being compressed and accelerated under the pressure of mass death. Land in medieval England was not owned in the simple modern sense of absolute and unencumbered title. It was held within a hierarchy of tenure, a system in which every holding was held of a superior lord in exchange for services or dues, and that superior held of a yet higher lord, and so on up through the ranks to the crown, which held ultimately of no one. A piece of ground was therefore enmeshed in a web of overlapping rights and obligations, the holder owing services upward, the superior owing protection, and the confirmation of title downward, the whole structure a pyramid of mutual obligation with the king at the apex. To transfer a holding was not simply to hand it from one person to another, it was to rearrange a node in this web, to substitute one holder for another within the structure of tenure, and to do so in a way that satisfied the interests of everyone with a stake in the holding, the superior lord above and any subordinate holders below. The instruments by which such transfers were made were formal and documented, because the medieval mind, for all its differences from our own, shared with us an obsession with the security of title and the documentation of right. A transfer of land was recorded in a deed, a written instrument attested by witnesses, sealed with the seals of the parties, drawn according to forms that had developed over centuries and that the courts would recognise and enforce. The deed established who had transferred what to whom, on what terms, subject to what obligations, and its existence and its proper form were what made the transfer secure against later challenge. A transfer made without proper documentation or in defective form was vulnerable, and in a society that litigated land disputes endlessly, the security of a well-drawn deed was a thing of real and practical value. In the crisis of 1348, this machinery had to operate at unaccustomed speed, and the operation under pressure is itself a window into how medieval institutions behaved when stressed. The land for emergency burial had to be acquired, which meant the machinery of transfer had to engage, the holding identified, the holder's willingness or compulsion secured, the interests of the superior lord accommodated, the deed drawn and witnessed and sealed, the title established. All of this normally took time, the negotiation and the drafting and the formal execution, but in the crisis it was compressed, done quickly, the forms observed but accelerated, because the need was urgent and the dead were arriving faster than the ground could be readied. And yet the forms were observed, the deeds were drawn, the title was secured, the machinery did not break under the pressure. It accelerated, performing in days what it might ordinarily perform in months, because the security of the title mattered even in the crisis, because a burial ground established on defective title would have been vulnerable once the crisis passed, and because the men arranging it understood that the dead needed legally secure ground as much as they needed consecrated ground. The consecration that followed was a separate process, governed by the law of the church rather than the law of the realm, and it too proceeded through forms that were ancient and established, and that had to be observed for the consecration to be valid. The blessing of new burial ground was a function of episcopal authority, performed by the bishop or by someone acting under his delegated power, and it involved the formal setting apart of the ground, the ritual that changed its status from ordinary land to consecrated ground, sacred and protected and dedicated to the burial of the faithful. The ritual was performed according to the established form, the word said, the ground blessed, the consecration recorded in the registers of the diocese, and from that moment the ground was holy, set apart permanently, available for the lawful burial of the Christian dead. The consecration could be accelerated under the pressure of crisis, performed quickly to ready the ground before the dead arrived. But like the transfer of title, it could not be abandoned, because unconsecrated ground could not lawfully receive the faithful, and the burial of the faithful in Musset unconsecrated ground was a thing the church and the people would not accept. Once the ground was acquired and consecrated, the burials themselves proceeded according to the practical logistics we have described. The grid of trenches, the layered interment, the maintained orientation. the careful treatment of each body according to the form even at the height of the catastrophe, and the burials too generated records, where the record-keeping survived, the registers of the dead, the accounts of the burials, the documentation that allowed the use of the ground to be tracked even as the volume of death strained the capacity of those keeping the records. The medieval habit of documentation extended even to the burial of the plague dead, even in the crisis, even as the clerks themselves died, and the surviving records, scattered and incomplete, preserve in writing the use of the burial grounds that the clay preserves in physical form. The closing of a burial ground when it reached capacity was the final procedural act, and it too left its trace in the records and in the law. A ground that was full ceased to be used, but its consecrated status persisted, and the persistence of that status carried obligations and protections that endured long after the last burial. The ground remained sacred, remained protected, remained the resting place of the faithful awaiting resurrection, and could not be casually returned to secular use or built over without regard for its status. This persistence of consecrated status is the legal root of the long protection of the buried dead, the reason a burial ground retained its protected character across the centuries even as the memory of its specific contents faded, the reason the modern law inherited a presumption against the disturbance of consecrated burial ground that traces directly back to the medieval rule. The closing of the ground did not end its protection. It began the long period of protected disuse during which the ground was sealed and gradually forgotten, its status enduring in the law even as its memory faded from the minds of the living. And this is the complete apparatus of the seal, traced now down to its smallest working parts. The acquisition of the land through the machinery of medieval tenure and the formal deed, accelerated under crisis but never abandoned. The consecration through the established forms of episcopal authority, readying the ground for the lawful burial of the faithful. The burials themselves through the practical logistics of trench and layer and maintained orientation. The records that tracked the use of the ground even in the crisis, and the closing of the ground into protected disuse, its consecrated status enduring, its memory fading, its contents sealed in the preserving clay. Each part of the apparatus contributed to the seal, the legal security of the title, and the sacred status of the consecration and the physical organization of the burials and the documentary record and the enduring protection of the closed ground, and together they constituted the means by which a field became, in the space of a terrible year, a sealed and permanent repository of the city's dead, protected by law and ritual and preserved by the clay, exactly as it remains today beneath the surface that has forgotten it. The whole of it, then, the entire sealed world, rests upon this convergence of forces, the medieval and the modern, the legal and the physical, the religious and the secular, the deliberate and the accidental, all of them pointing the same way, toward the preservation of the buried world and the maintenance of the seal. The dead were sealed by the law that protected consecrated ground, and by the clay that preserved their bodies, and by the cost that discouraged their disturbance, and by the forgetting that erased their memory from the surface, and the four forces together held the seal across the centuries, durable because distributed, permanent because dependent on no single thing. And the rivers were sealed by the engineering that vaulted them, and the convenience that demoted them, and the forgetting that erased them from the surface map. And the Roman floor was sealed by the accumulation that buried it, and the clay that preserved it, and the forgetting that reduced it to a faint influence on the shape of the streets, all of it sealed by the convergent forces, all of it preserved in the patient clay, all of it held beneath the surface that proceeds in its necessary unknowing, the sealed world beneath London, real and undisturbed and permanent exactly as the title promised, sealed not by conspiracy but by the quiet and convergent and permanent operation of everything that bears upon the question of whether the ground beneath a city should ever be opened, and the answer renewed forever by an action that it should not. And now, at the very end, with everything named and laid down and understood, there is nothing left to do but rest within the buried world, in the dark, in the clay, in the patient permanence, and let the city above go quiet. The plague dead lie in their trenches in their orderly rows, and they have lain there for nearly 7 centuries, undisturbed, sealed, preserved, and they will lie there for centuries more, in the same cold clay and the same arrested stillness, while the surface city changes and rebuilds and forgets above them. The rivers flow in their dark vaults, the Fleet and the Tyburn and the Walbrook and all the rest, carrying their water down toward the Thames as they have for thousands of years, sealed beneath the streets, demoted and contained and unseen, flowing in the dark. The sewers carry their flow in their egg-shaped tunnels, the buried machine running on, maintained by the few who descend into the dark to keep it working, essential and invisible and unregarded. The Roman floor lies at the bottom, the original foundation, buried and preserved beneath everything, shaping the surface it no longer supports. The clay holds all of it in its patient impermeable grip, in its oxygen-poor stillness, in its arrested decay, preserving the dead and the rivers and the foundations across the centuries, indifferent to time, indifferent to the changing surface, fixed and stable and permanent. The clay was here before the city and will be here after it, when the present surface has itself become another buried layer in the endless accumulation, another stratum sealed beneath the ones that follow, another part of the buried world held in the patient clay. The clay is the deepest thing, the oldest thing, the most permanent thing, and the clay holds the sealed world beneath London, exactly as it has held it across all the centuries, and exactly as it will hold it for all the centuries to come. The surface sleeps above the depth, the living sleep above the dead, the bright temporary present sleeps above the dark sealed past, and the boundary between them, the thin forgotten layer of clay that separates the city that walks from the city that waits, holds, as it has always held, sealed and dark and undisturbed. Nobody opened the world beneath, nobody will. It rests in the clay, sealed by the law and the cost and the engineering and the forgetting, preserved by the patient impermeable grip of the deep deposit. Waiting in the dark beneath the city that does not remember, it is there. And there it remains, the sealed world beneath London, real in every detail, undisturbed across the centuries, held in the patient clay, beneath the surface that sleeps above it, in the dark, in the silence, in the permanence, exactly as it has remained, and exactly as it will remain, sealed and preserved, and at rest. Before the silence settles fully, there is the matter of the people who still go down, and their work deserves a slow and patient accounting, because they are the only living souls who routinely enter the sealed world. And their descent is the one regular human intrusion into the dark that otherwise belongs entirely to the dead and the water and the clay. The workers who maintain the great sewers descend on a schedule into the brick tunnels to inspect and to clear and to repair, and their work is among the strangest occupations the city offers, a daily passage into a buried architecture that almost no one else will ever see. They go down through access shafts, into the egg-shaped tunnels, into the dark and the wet and the cellular, equipped against the hazards of the buried air and the moving water, and they walk the brick passages that the Victorians built, inspecting the brickwork for the first signs of the slow failure that the clay is always working toward. The inspection is patient and methodical, a passage along the tunnels with the eye and the light, looking for the cracks and the deformations and the early failures that signal the clay beginning to win its slow war against the brick. A crack in the lining, a place where the brickwork has begun to deform under the pressure of the surrounding clay, a section where the water has begun to find its way behind the brick. Any of these is a sign that the structure is beginning to lose its long balance with the ground, and the inspection exists to find these signs early, before the slow failure becomes a fast one, before a deformation becomes a collapse. The workers read the brickwork the way a doctor reads a body, looking for the early symptoms of the failure that the clay's patient pressure makes inevitable across a long enough span, and their reading allows the repairs to be made in time, the brickwork reinforced or replaced, the balance with the clay restored, the buried machine kept running. The clearing is the other great task, the removal of the deposits that accumulate in the tunnels despite the self-cleansing design, the sediment and the debris and the congealed masses that build up in the slower sections, and that must be physically removed before they grow large enough to obstruct the flow. This work is laborious and unpleasant, the breaking up and the removal of the accumulated material done by hand and by machine in the confined dark of the tunnels, a constant battle against the tendency of the flow to deposit its load wherever it slows. The deposits, left unaddressed, would gradually narrow and eventually block the tunnels, and so the clearing is continuous, a perpetual maintenance of the buried machine against the slow accumulation that would otherwise choke it. The workers who do this work are the custodians of the one part of the sealed world that cannot be left to the clay, the one part that must keep functioning, and their continuous labour is what keeps it functioning, year after year, in the dark, unregarded by the surface that depends on it. The flushing of the system is a related discipline. the use of the flow itself to clear the tunnels, the management of the water to keep it moving fast enough to carry its load and prevent the deposits from settling. The Victorian engineers designed the egg-shaped section precisely to maintain the velocity of the flow at low volume, to keep the dry weather flow concentrated in the narrow, lower channel where it would run fast enough to be self-cleansing. And the modern management of the system continues this logic, the flow managed and the velocity maintained, the storm flows used where possible to flush the tunnels clear. The hydraulics of the system are a constant preoccupation, the balance of velocity and volume and gradient that keeps the tunnels clear and the flow moving. The engineering of moving water through the buried network that the Victorians designed and that the modern city maintains. It is dull and exacting work, the management of flow through a century-and-a-half-old network of brick tunnels, and it is essential, and it proceeds continuously in the dark beneath the surface that never thinks of it. These workers, then, are the exception that defines the rule of the sealed world. Everywhere else, the buried world is left undisturbed, sealed and dark and patient, entered only where the building of the surface city unavoidably requires it. But the sewers must keep functioning, and so they must be entered, regularly, by the workers who maintain them, and their descent is the one routine human presence in the buried world, the one place where the living regularly enter the dark, and even their presence confirms the seal rather than breaching it, because they enter only to maintain, only to keep the buried machine running, only to do the work that the surface depends on, and they leave the rest of the buried world entirely alone, the plague dead and the Roman floor and the deep clay all untouched by their passage, the sewers maintained and everything else left sealed. They are the custodians of one thread of the buried world, and their custody of that one thread throws into relief the undisturbed silence of everything else, the dead and the foundations and the deep clay that no one enters, that no one maintains, that lies in the dark exactly as it has lain for centuries, sealed and preserved and at rest. And so even the living presence in the buried world is a kind of confirmation of its sealing, a narrow and necessary intrusion that leaves the vast remainder undisturbed, a single thread of human activity in a world otherwise given over entirely to the dead and the water and the patient clay. The workers descend and maintain and ascend, and the buried machine runs on, and everything else remains sealed, and the surface above proceeds in its unknowing, depending on the buried machine without thinking of it, walking above the buried dead without remembering them, crossing above the buried rivers without hearing them. The sealed world holds, maintained where it must be maintained, and otherwise left in the dark, and the boundary between the surface and the depth holds, crossed only where it must be crossed and otherwise sealed. And the whole vast buried apparatus of the city's past remains beneath the bright temporary present, preserved in the clay, sealed by the convergent forces, waiting in the dark, exactly as it has waited across all the centuries and exactly as it will wait for all the centuries still to come.